Welcome to Curious Campus, where we talk to professors from various departments at the University of Toronto about a recent research topic they've dived into, breaking down these new developments for everyone to understand. Stay tuned, you'll definitely learn something new. I'm Chubby, and today I'm here with Professor Anushka Ataullahjan, and we're going to talk about her research on the gendered impact of climate change. To introduce Professor Anushka Ataullahjan is an assistant professor in the School of Health Studies in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Western University, and an assistant professor, status only, at the Social and Behavioral Health Sciences Division at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. Professor Anushka Ataullahjan is a critical qualitative researcher whose research explores the health of women, children, and adolescents in low and middle income countries, particularly Pakistan. Drawing from multiple disciplines such as anthropology, demography, and public health, she aims to understand how health decisions are shaped by social, political, and religious ideologies. Her research situates health beliefs and practices in their larger context, which includes their regional, national, and global histories. It also explores the class and caste-based histories that give rise to particular inequities and health practices. As mentioned, we're here to discuss her research on the gendered impact of climate change. Without further ado, Anushka, welcome to Curious Campus.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to chatting with you today.
Me too. So, to get us started off, I'm very interested in how you found yourself in this space of public health and then also kind of how you got interested in more like this gendered impact and focusing on women and children health.
Yeah, so my background is South Asian, and as a young child, as an adolescent, I had an interest in science. And so, like many South Asian folks, you're interested in science, so that means you should go into medicine. So that was sort of the mindset that I had when I entered undergrad. And I did undergrad at U of T St. George in life sci, and I was just really focused on going to med school. And what happened was that there were a few little hiccups along the way, and I couldn't take my MCAT. And so I decided that I would take a little bit of a break. I would do my master's because I knew that I wanted to work globally. And I would do my master's and then I would apply to med school afterwards. And so I went to the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in the UK. And that was the first time that I was exposed to public health research. In my mind, what research was really sitting in a lab and, pipetting. And for me, that didn't fit anything that I wanted to do. And I never could have imagined that research could look like the type of work that I conduct now. And so that was my first exposure. And that's when I really started to think, huh, maybe I actually want to be more in the research space. Maybe I really want to be working in this population level. And so that shifted my career. And the interest in Pakistan in gender has just been something that I've been interested in since I was a young child. I was fortunate enough as a child to make frequent trips to Pakistan to see family there. My background is Pakistani. And so through that, I was exposed to some of the gender inequities at a very young age. And it sparked a lot of questions about why the experiences of folks there were very different than my experiences in Canada. Why, when I was there, I had to behave in certain ways and be present in certain public spaces in certain ways that I didn't have to in Canada. And from that, that interest in gender really, really grew, and that interest in how it shapes behaviors in Pakistan also grew.
That's really cool. So the particular research that we're talking about like focuses on like kind of around the time of the 2022 floods in Pakistan. Were you doing like previous research on, I guess, like other public health policies surrounding women beforehand that kind of domino effect into this?
Yeah, so I've been doing research in Pakistan for over a decade now on a variety of different topics. Some of my early work was looking at family planning use and understanding the decision-making process and what were the different factors that shape those decisions. I've done some work on maternal health as well, looking at some childhood conditions as well related to stunting, anemia, polio vaccination. So a range of different topics. And my work in the floods really came out of the fact that some of the communities where I do conduct research, particularly in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, were so greatly affected by the floods. And it felt that it was something that I couldn't ignore in my research, that I had to really focus in on, especially because we know that Pakistan has a large number of glaciers. Actually, outside of the polar regions, Pakistan has the third highest number of glaciers in the world. So we know that many of the impacts of climate change, especially with global warming, that they are going to increase. So it felt really important that I am better understanding the gendered impacts in this context because it will be a thread that is going to impact all elements of health.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. So then to kind of like form the base of like your research, like have you found anything on like why women are more vulnerable and susceptible to the negative impacts of climate change? And also how that relates to public policy and like the health policy around this.
Yeah, so what we know globally, and not just from my work, what we know in general is that whenever there is any type of humanitarian crisis, that it does tend to affect those that are the most marginalized or disenfranchised, that it affects them more. And so if there aren't specific policies and programs that are specifically focused on those groups, that the gap in the population actually widens. It's not just that everybody is impacted and everybody is shifted downwards. It's actually the gap does widen. And this is due for when we're talking about gender, this is due to a variety of different reasons. Of course, there are existing power structures that, shape everything with respect to access to resources, with respect to behaviors, practices. So there's a lot of different ways that gender shapes what is available to women and also the types of recourses that they have if they are dealing with any of the impacts of climate change or any type of a disaster. So, in the Pakistani context, what we found is that a lot of the impacts are also related to segregation norms, such as parda, and that has really shaped women's ability to access resources. And then also just, the patriarchal context and the power dynamics within the household have also shaped women's experiences post floods.
So the theory that you're like forming here through your research was based on like concept of necropolitics. So can you explain more about it and how it relates to the kind of research that you're doing?
Yeah. So necropolitics is a theory that's been coined by Achilles Mbembe, and he is a scholar who's based out of Africa, and he builds on the work of Foucault's concept of biopower. And biopower is basically the regulation of life. And what Mbembe puts forward with necropolitics is the ways in which so life and death are regulated. And so there is the ways in which some individuals are given resources to live, some individuals are not given the same resources. And so when we're thinking about it within the context of the work that I'm doing, what we're really looking at is basically the way that global systems, first of all, have led to certain folks in certain geographies really disproportionately experiencing the impacts of climate change. And those are not always the individuals that are actually contributing the most to climate change. We know that the global north are the folks that are contributing the most to climate change, and the impacts are being felt very much so in the global south. So there's that sort of macro level impacts that we're talking about. But then we're also talking about within a country about where resources are put. How are protections and infrastructure being built in certain places, and how does that also then have impacts on who gets to live and who gets to die? So thinking about that underdevelopment that also happens.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think that is like that's what it relates to the concept of parda as well, right? Where there are these regulations on the women and how they can access resources that are valuable to them, especially in terms of climate change, for example, or such events that would cause them to need more care. So, how did necropolitics and parda together, how does this impact your research and how, like, on how it was being able to be conducted?
Yeah, so when we're thinking about, the experiences, especially the women in my field site experience, they're experiencing marginalization, disenfranchisement from different power structures. That so when we think about it, kind of like intersectional approach of like thinking about like the different systems of oppression that are they're experiencing. One of them is related to the geographies where they live, related to socioeconomics, and there's that piece of it. And then there's another related to gender and the patriarchal system. So they're doubly experiencing those power systems. And, I would say that necropolitics doesn't really impact the way that I conduct my research, but part of that itself does influence a lot of the ways that we have to approach the work, especially when considering being culturally appropriate and the ways that we engage with women in the community and also engage with men in the community so that they feel comfortable having, the women in the community actually participate. Because given the context, we are not speaking to male community members and we're not getting their buy-in. We actually could be putting the women that we're speaking to at risk.
So how is that negotiation then with being able to like talk to these women, especially like considering like you being one of like the main researchers on this was also trying to get access to the space and it was easier for you to talk to the women, but maybe not have those negotiations with the men to allow you to talk to the women, which again was like forced by the
We work in like big teams where we have, male researchers and we also have female researchers. And so the way that we usually work is that whenever we're first entering any type of a field site, so I'll give you an example. I was there just a few months ago with the team, and it was myself and I had a few research assistants that were with me. And we were going in the village. And we also had a male research lead who was also traveling with us. And so when we would go into the household and we would sit with the women, if there were any male family members that had any questions, what we would do was that we would actually direct them to the male researcher outside. So we'd say, oh, there's somebody from our team. They're outside. They're there to speak to you. And also, the male researcher would just kind of be standing outside the house so that as other community men would be walking by, maybe they would have a question of like, who are these strangers? Because, it's a village, so folks know each other. So if they had questions about like, who are these strangers that are here in the village? What are they doing? They could just stop, they could chat with him. And that helps to establish trust so that then you start to be known in the community, you start to build relationships. And for this project specifically, we are actually talking to male community members as well. The female researchers speak to the women, and we do FGDs with the women, but the male researchers actually are doing transit walks, which are these community walks with male community members as well. So that helps them also, continue to build that rapport too.
how are you able to establish this kind of method of being able to do the research as you wanted to and get all of the information? Was it due to your own background or because you had done previous work here or your team had been from the area or such? Like, what was the kind of like struggle to find the rhythm that worked?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of all of the above. So, being from the cultural context means that I have had exposure to a lot of the cultural concepts. But culture is not static, and it does not, even if you're talking about the same ethnic group, it is not the same from location to location. So there's a lot of learning that has to happen when we enter a new field site. What works, 3 hours down the road may not be appropriate when we actually go to this new context. Something else might be appropriate. So a lot of it means that as a qualitative researcher, as an ethnographer, you are always learning from community. You're always adapting. You're listening to what folks that are elders in the community say is appropriate. You're thinking about what are the norms. You're observing. So you're looking at like, simple things like the way folks dress. As a qualitative researcher, you want to be dressed in the way that other community members are dressed. So you're looking around to see like, oh, are folks wearing scarves like this or are they veiling like that? And there may be slight different adaptations that you are constantly making. And, a lot of it is working with folks that have experience in communities. We always like to hire research assistants that are local. So then they do have an idea of like the geographies and they are often embedded in the communities. And sometimes even those conversations with research assistants can be really fascinating because they give you insights into your topic as well and help you understand it in a different lens.
Yeah, that's really cool. And because this research kind of like is structured around a specific event that happened, I'm not sure like how close you had like begun doing your research to this disaster. Then when you were getting these anecdotes, like either talking to the men and women, were you able to tell like how reliable it was? I don't know if you went around more villages in the Khyber region and was there like any observations to be made that could also add like more of like the researchers, like more objective insight to this, along with the anecdotes that you get about like what the situation was?
So I guess I would say that, first of all, as a qualitative researcher, we kind of push back against this idea of objectivity. We think that the way that folks share with us is always co-created. So it is always a subjective experience. If you were to go into the same village and do the exact same research with the exact same questions and then analyze the exact same data, what you would come up with would be slightly different than what I would come up with. And so, when we're thinking about, the ways that these ideas are co-constructed. So I would say that understanding folks' experiences and the ways that they narrate those experiences are really what's important. So as opposed to, like a quantitative survey where I'm looking at like, what are the actual physical damages and like what was the value of the property that you lost or, those types of things. I want to understand, how did they experience it? How did they feel during it? What were the impacts? How did they feel like their life has changed since it? Like, how are they narrating those experiences in their day-to-day lives?
That's really interesting. And I'm curious then, so because the talking to the men and women in this was done sort of separately, was there like different questions that you would be asking them? And I think that you guys are still doing like the analysis as we go along, but were you also getting like kind of like opposite responses from them based on like their experience, especially like because you're focusing on the impact that the woman faced during this time?
So, I mean, I wouldn't say we're getting opposite responses. We're getting responses that kind of fit together, but are different perspectives. So, what we're doing right now, and we're currently collecting data in our final field site, and we should be finished there in the next few weeks. And so, we're, analyzing what we have so far, and then we'll be doing that final analysis once that data starts rolling in as well. And what we're doing with in our data collection is that we're doing focus group discussions with women, and what we're focusing on is their experiences before the floods, during the floods, and after the floods. And we're doing a few different really interesting techniques, looking at like how they spent their time at these different periods, looking at, if they had any repeating dreams that came to them, thinking about that as like, a way that you can get entry point into understanding like mental health. We're using something called group object narrative, where we have them bring in an object that represents their experiences with the floods and ask them to tell the story of why this is important to them. And group, we come to use a consensus model to think about as a group what is most important to the collective. And with men, what we're doing is something completely separate, where we're doing transit walks. So transit walks are basically walks through the community. And as you're walking through the community, you're asking questions about the way that the geography has changed. You're asking about how it impacts health and well-being. So it is thinking about that idea of like, the impact that place has also on health and well-being. So we're kind of focused on different aspects. But what we're hearing from the men is very similar to what we're hearing from women, but we're hearing something different. Like, for instance, men will talk about, like, oh, we couldn't go to the market, so we had to rely, like, our bridges were broken, so we couldn't, we had to rely on, like, we had little farmlands and we had to rely on what the farmlands were and use the food from there. And so, that's what we did. And you hear the same from women, but what you'll hear as an added piece from women is yes, and oftentimes when we would be eating, women, we eat last. And so a lot of the food would be finished. And so there wouldn't be roti for us to eat. And we would just have to eat, the vegetables on their own or things of that nature. So we're hearing more information. And like that's why it's really, really important for us to be talking to people who have lived experience, because they actually lived it. They actually know that the best compared to anybody else.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, were you planning for this to be like separate, like how you would like approach speaking to the women and speaking to the men, or was it something that you kind of had to adapt? Like maybe you thought like you could also do transit walks or such with the women, but you realized like it wouldn't be possible because of the restrictions placed on them.
From when we were planning, because I've done a fair amount of work in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, I know that there's a lot of mobility limitations for women, and many, because of part of the norms that restrict women's access to public spaces, I knew that it would not be possible for women to, most of the time, be able to do transit walks. So we never actually intended to do transect walks with women. We did sort of frame it that like if in the case a woman is, open to and willing to, we will then do a transect walk with her. But it's something that we know is not sort of culturally appropriate in that context.
So you have some preliminary findings now that kind of put all this information into three categories of productive work, reproductive work, and community work. So I'm very curious about how your health research or health research in general is conducted with the cultural and societal norms present, and whether it's possible to separate them or whether it's even like wanted to separate them to be able to actually tackle the issue of health policy and health research.
I would say that culture shapes so much of the way that we experience even the same condition. And so there's some really interesting work, really seminal work that's been done by Margaret Locke, and she published this in the early 90s. And she was doing research on menopause. And when she was looking at menopause, she was looking at the way it was experienced in Japan and the way that it was experienced in North America. Now we think of menopause and we think of it as like this biological process. So if it's a biological process, the way that folks experience it should be same in these different contexts. But what she actually found from her work was really that in Japan, the way that women were articulating their symptoms was very, very different than the ways that women in North America were articulating their symptoms of menopause. And she coined this term called local biology, where she basically says that like even when we're talking about biological processes, we need to think about it with respect to its cultural context and the ways that sociocultural context actually shapes even the way we experience the biological process. So I tend to draw on and build on that type of, theoretical perspective that when we are talking about, any type of a health condition or experience, we must be locating it within its cultural context because that is going to shape the ways that people articulate that experience around that condition, but also it's going to shape the recourses that are available to them and what they think is appropriate recourses as well. Thinking back to some of my work around like family planning in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, when we're thinking about things like contraceptives, there's a range of contraceptives that are available, globally available, but given the sociocultural context, some of them were more suitable than others. Some folks felt more comfortable using than others, and a lot of this was related to the way that folks conceptualize the impacts of contraceptives on their bodies and outside of the Western biomedical frame as well. So, to answer your question, basically, I think that we have to think about culture. We have to think about how it shapes health. And that's why, I'm a qualitative researcher. So, of course, that is something that I think is really important is, having that in-depth qualitative work that can give you that perspective on locating behaviors and practices in the larger sociocultural context.
That's really interesting. And based on your planning then, like were you expecting a certain outcome or response from your research to be, especially within Khyber Pakhtunkhwa where your research is being conducted? And has that like changed since doing some on-site research?
What I was expecting was that there was going to be gendered impacts, and I think I wasn't necessarily clear about what those gendered impacts would look like. But I knew that there was going to be some gendered impact just from what we know in the literature. What I've found interesting is where there have been silences and where folks have been very reluctant to speak. And one of those areas is gender-based violence. And we know anecdotally, and we know that people have told us, off the record, not in interviews and folks discussions, sort of on the side in a conversation saying, like, please don't say that I said it. We know that there has been an increase around intimate partner violence post the floods, but folks are not open to speaking about it. And, there's a lot of reasons why. And so that has been one of the areas where there has been a silence. And I think that also then speaks to the gravity of how important it is for us to be thinking about it. Because even, if folks are in this kind of a context, not feeling comfortable speaking about the fact that this is happening in their community, that means that the need for appropriate resources and programming is probably even greater than we imagine.
Mhm. Now, having gone through like the first step of this research, then do you expect this research to kind of like change mindsets or improve mindsets against these like negative impacts that the women are facing?
Changing perspectives and mindsets is really, really difficult. And so I think of the work that I do, I think of it as having a short-term goal and a long-term goal. So the long-term goal is definitely to move the needle on the way that basically around gender to make it, sort of improve gender equity. That is sort of the long term goal to change perspectives, change mindsets, create more of an open space. But in the short term, what I think about is really given that these are the existing systems, and yes, we want to change these systems, the change doesn't happen overnight. How can we actually then have provisions that are safeguarding women's health and well-being so that, if there is any type of future disaster crises and there is need that we are ensuring that women's needs are being put at the forefront and that they're not being left behind. So I think that the longer term of changing mindsets, I would hope so. I don't know. I think in the short term, we've been working very closely with Provincial Disaster Management Authority throughout this project to really develop recommendations that they can then incorporate into some of their guidance documents. So I am cautiously optimistic that maybe some of this will be able to make some policy impacts as well.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And having done separate research like in this area and in Pakistan as a whole, have you found a lot of support from either high levels of government or even like local communities and like these village leaders to enact some of the things that would like help the women being impacted by this?
Yeah, I think it depends on like what topic I'm looking at. So when we're talking about things such as like maternal health, I think that's something that there is a lot of appetite to, improve maternal health because I think that fits very much so into one of the appropriate roles that folks see for women. But when we talk about something such as family planning, given the fact that family planning is not always something that folks think that limiting fertility has, and we could probably talk for an hour about, all the beliefs around limiting fertility, but let's just say that it's a very complex area which has very mixed support. So sometimes working on those topics, there is less support at a community level. But when you're working on child health, there's definitely a lot of support because folks, want to improve health and well-being. So it really depends on what the specific topic is and how it is viewed.
Have you seen any impact on how this research is being considered because of you and like possibly like other researchers on the team being women also kind of being part of this research process, especially in these more conservative settings?
Not really. I think that actually, a lot of folks, when I do go into households and I speak to women, that they actually are really excited because a lot of them will say that nobody's ever asked them their opinion before. And I think it's really important that we contextualize sort of in the Pakistani context, where it's like the work that I do is mainly in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa with Pakhtun women. I'm Pashto speaking. And if we talk about a lot of like, the large institutions where there's a lot of research and funding that is, being pumped into research, a lot of them are located in, Punjab, of course, also in Karachi, with some of the big institutions there like AKU. And so a lot of the folks that are there, a lot of the women that are doing that type of work are not actually Pashto speaking. And when we think about the institutions that are in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa that are doing research, a lot of the researchers there and the academics there are male. So what that means is that you have this gap of female Pakhtun or Pashto speaking researchers who are able to, go into households and speak to women because as we remember before, the part of the norms that restrict non-familial men from speaking to women also restrict, male researchers from being able to speak to female participants. And so oftentimes when I do go in and I actually am speaking to women, they're really excited to share their perspectives because they don't feel like their perspectives have really been highlighted or prioritized before.
That's really cool. So I'm curious because you mentioned this. So has it been somewhat easier for you, like coming with this Pashtun background and speaking Pashto compared to even other people from the country, Punjabi and Sindhis, who may have also like kind of lived through that experience of being faced with this, with Barda and such. Has that actually played a big like role in being able to talk to these women and get their input?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on like who you're speaking to. So like when you're speaking to Pakhtun women, like a lot of them will only speak Pashto, or like in some areas they'll speak some other like local languages as well. Like some of the women in the field sites that we are doing work in, they speak Torwali, which is not a very commonly spoken language. And so any individual that does not speak Pashto then would have to have some type of a translator who'd be able to facilitate the conversation. And anytime that you're working with a translator, it's never quite the same as being able to speak to somebody directly. And especially when you're thinking about qualitative research and you're thinking about building relationships and building trust, because it is really about trust. When somebody's telling you their story of their experience, especially a difficult experience, they need to be able to trust you and trust what you're going to do with that. So building trust in those contexts when you're working through a translator, it can sometimes be a little bit more difficult. So I would say that it is a different experience. And so being able to speak to women directly does help and facilitate. Now, of course, I am also Canadian born. So I do have an accent. There's a lot of signifiers around me that like do also create distance. So these are all things that, you're negotiating in that relationship. So I'm not completely an insider also with the communities that I work with. I am an outsider in many ways as well.
It's really interesting. As mentioned, this qualitative research that you're doing, how do you then like go about like analyzing it to either like gain insights for kind of like more like field understanding and also to be able to present as things that can be done to help these people?
Yeah, so when you're analyzing qualitative data, I mean, it's a very specific process that you're engaging with, but a lot of it, like at a high level, involves just becoming familiar with the data, and then you're going through and you're coding the data, and you have your research objectives in mind, you have theoretical frame in mind, and you're coding this data, and you're developing themes. And so seeing like what are basically this thread that links through all of these different interviews or focus group discussions and pulling that thread out and thinking about solutions. One of the things that we've done with solutions is that we also, in the focus group discussions, when we are talking to women, we're actually also asking them for what they would also give as solutions, like what advice they would give to somebody that was going through the same thing as them, what advice they would give to government as well, because we want to also, prioritize their knowledge. And I think too often when we are doing global work, we think of the work that we're doing as a hierarchy. We are the folks that have the knowledge and we know better. And then we think of the folks that are in, the context that are the participants. We think like, they don't know as much. They're like ignorant. They're all of that. And really, that's super problematic because actually, they are the most knowledgeable about their experiences. They actually have a lot of the answers. So, what we're really trying to do in this project specifically is really focus on like what they already know are the answers and how can we take then, these community identified solutions and really bring those to the forefront, take those to policymakers because they're the experts. They're the experts. We're just the folks that are really there as students to learn from their experience and really be able to then kind of bring that together and put it forth.
That's really cool. Did you start off with like a more specific research question, like coming into this, that was kind of to build up on what the gendered impact would be?
The question was really around like, what are the gendered impacts, right? And then looking at specific dimensions, thinking about, inequities within populations. So we also wanted to look at even within every community, who in that community was being prioritized versus others and what were their experiences. So thinking about things such as ethnicity, thinking about caste, thinking about class. So looking at those varied experiences as well. And we did a lot of research on, what are the gendered impacts of climate change? So we had ideas around, what are some of the potential ways that climate change may be impacting health. And we use that to kind of inform our guides when we were asking questions. So using those as areas that we're probing around when we're asking folks about their experiences before, after, and during the floods.
Hmm. And did you see like there was actually like a lot of divide between like the population? Like you talk about caste, for example, like how I thought it was that all these like villages would kind of be like everyone in them there'd be like a bunch of villages and maybe like all these people had like somewhat like similar status. But did that have you seen like a big divide then between families that you've talked to and the women from these different families?
Yeah, there's definitely different levels of different types of experiences within each village. And a lot of what we're seeing the divide around is actually around socioeconomics and how that has then been able to buffer folks' ability to recover after the floods. Because we are still at the preliminary stage of the analysis, I don't really know exactly how some of the other power systems are at play yet. So that can be a stay tuned question as we have more information over the next few months.
Yeah, really exciting. And based on what you have so far and your prior knowledge, what would you say would be the next steps to building like a more gender inclusive environment for a more equitable response to climate change, especially considering conservative environments like Khyber Pakhtunkhwa?
Yeah, so I think, the first and the most important thing is that, women need a seat at the table. We need to have them actually be a part of the conversations when we are thinking about response plans, when we are thinking about, strategies, that they need to actually be there to be able to give their perspective. And I think that's the most difficult thing, especially in these contexts, for all the reasons that I cited around Parda. But ultimately, I think until women's voices are actually centered in these conversations, we're not going to end up with strategies that are actually going to be, gender inclusive. They are going to be actually widening the gap. And I've been speaking a lot about women, and I also do want to acknowledge that, like, there are other, gender minorities. We aren't talking about folks that are trans. We're not talking about, those groups that face even more marginalization and disenfranchisement and have that gap increase even more when they're not prioritized in terms of policies and programs. So this is just really sort of a start to, thinking about when I think about gender inclusive is like having women at the table, but there's so much more that actually needs to be done.
Yeah, of course. And as like a start, have you seen like even, for example, like the village leader's like wife possibly have like some sort of seat at the table to be able to raise these issues, or is that like still more closed off and obviously like a lot of work to be done there?
So I would say that a lot of like the conversations that happen, especially with respect to gender, like sort of respect to the response to the floods, they were happening at the level of like humanitarian actors. And a lot of the leaders of the, those organizations, a lot of them were men, and oftentimes like communities were not involved at the same level. That happened, in more the rebuilding phase, a little bit like, but then in the immediacy, it was more just humanitarian actors that were there. So haven't really seen too much of that quite yet in terms of, women in the community that are there and having a seat at the table. But that being said, one of the priorities of the Provincial Disaster Management Authority in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is gender. They have a gender and child cell. And so it is a priority. It is something that they are really doing a lot of work trying to bring to the forefront. There's just still a lot more work that needs to be done.
Is this humanitarian aid that comes in and helps like rebuild these communities and support these communities, do they generally like come then from the region, or is it like more broadly from the country, or is it more like international response that isn't quite aware of the context, as you've mentioned, like the big part is like the culture and the norms of these communities? Do they come in with that mindset, or is that also like something that needs a lot of work on to be able to support the people who are impacted?
Yeah, so there's a lot of like, especially when you think about something like the 2022 floods, is that there was, folks mobilizing across the country and especially in areas that were not affected by the flood and sending resources and funds to areas that were affected by the flood. You also had international actors who were coming in and working. But oftentimes when they are working with local community partners as well. So, there is an approach that is used to keep sure that they are working in a culturally appropriate way. That being said, there's always still things that fall through the cracks because it is, of course, a disaster setting. And so folks are working quickly. And so that can mean that, like, things like contraceptives, folks just like it wasn't a priority to distribute contraceptives as part of what was being given to women. There was a lot of push after the initial part of the floods around menstrual hygiene products because that was something that wasn't prioritized. And so there was this push to keep sure that women are getting menstrual hygiene products because, just because the floods happen doesn't mean, your periods stop. They continue. So there's a lot that sometimes can fall through. And there's a lot of also global guidance that actually dictates what should be done in these types of disaster setting, crisis settings, because there are things that can fall through the cracks.
Mhm. And in keeping in line with considering the gendered impact, this is specifically on like climate change, but to possibly like folks of my age or such, like what would you suggest considering when like thinking of natural disasters and like what's happening and like who it's impacting? Like, is there anything that you would recommend people a question like people should think about to be able to like understand the scope of what has happened? More to just like understand like again like the impact of the situation, right? Because a lot of this stuff is just like, oh, you read like a news article, maybe you see some videos about like what's happened, but it doesn't really like tell you about what's actually happened, right? Like these are very objective like things about, oh, like a glacier has melted and there's like a lot of water in these places that is, damage these quote unquote like poorly built houses or infrastructure, and all this infrastructure is not there, but more and so in like the human impact, right? Because that is what matters, right? If infrastructure is damaged but no one is using them, then it isn't quite as relevant as if there were people living there and things. So more so from that perspective, from what you've like seen,
Hmm.
like is there anything that to help get a better view of like what the human impact of these like disasters could
Yeah.
be?
Yeah, I mean, I think what that comes down to is sort of linked to what we were talking about earlier about, whose perspective are we prioritizing? And so when we're thinking about like where are we getting information from, sometimes we'll be reading the, large news sources and they're great for, that high level information, going to BBC, learning about like those high level damages of what's happening. But I do think that needs to be coupled with, local sources where you are then hearing people's actual stories and their actual experiences. So keeping sure that we're not just stopping at that high level of like, this is what's happening at a mass scale, because I think what also can happen, especially when we are thinking about humanitarian crises, is there's a level of dehumanization that can happen when we're starting to then think about like, this many thousand people were affected. And that number starts to be meaningless. But when we can actually learn about somebody's experiences and their stories, I think it's very different. It helps to humanize what's going on and it helps us to understand that we shouldn't just be so detached, especially, sitting with the privilege of like living in North America and in many ways not experiencing the impacts of climate change as folks are experiencing in other parts of the world. It's really important that we are recognizing that these are real people and their real lives that are being affected and that we're not turning away from that and that we're actually looking at that and learning about that and then thinking about what does that mean for us in the ways we live our lives.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And so I'm really excited for the analysis that then comes out from research.
If folks ever want to get in touch and to learn more, feel free to, if you Google me, you'll find my email address. Always happy to chat with folks. And thank you for facilitating this conversation and asking such thoughtful questions.
Thank you so much, then, Anushka. So that concludes our episode of Curious Campus with Professor Anushka. If anything you heard today interests you, definitely look out for her research on the gendered impact of climate change. Stay tuned to Curious Campus.